Well, I hope you've had a good week. I hope you've had a good day. I hope you are excited to study God's Word for the next few minutes tonight as we continue our study on the book of Ecclesiastes. You might remember last week we talked about a very famous part of the book of Ecclesiastes that most people are very familiar with. It's the poem that starts in chapter 3, verse 1, and goes through verse 8. But before we talk about maybe a little review from what we talked about last week and what we're going to get into what we're going to talk about tonight, I just want to say, as always, if you're sick or you're hurting, please let us know. We want to know that so we can be praying for you. That is the best possible thing that we could be doing. But we just want to also let you know that we love you. I do know that we have, I'm not going to mention by name, but I know that we have several people that are sick and are hurt or injured, and we certainly want to be praying for them. We certainly want to reach out to them and let them know how much they mean to us, how much we miss them when they're not able to be with us in person. So I don't think we have any announcements, so we'll get into it. Like we said, we talked about chapter 3, verses 1 through 8 last week, and you remember that Kohelet is just as upset as he was in chapters 1 and 2. But this poem in chapter 3 starts out with him saying that there is for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Now, like we said last week, this phrase under heaven is synonymous with the more often used phrase in the book, under the sun. But notice that we're talking about everything. So for everything in the world, for every activity, there is a specific time for that activity. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is we may have two things that almost appear contradictory to one another, but depending on the time, each of those things might be acceptable. Well, think about you know, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. Well, those are opposite of each other. But there's some times where it's appropriate to laugh, and there's some times where it's appropriate to weep. It just depends on the time. Now, like we said last week in verses 1 through 8, there's 14 pair of opposites that Kohelet talks about. These aren't prescriptions. These are descriptions, right? He's not telling us, you know, for instance, there's a time to be born. So if we take that as a prescription, well, there's a right time to be born, and, you know, that is to say, if you didn't hit the right time, then you were born at the wrong time, and, you know, sad for you. That's not what he's saying. He is telling us what he observes. Remember, this is his personal experience. He is driving the quest. He's not relying on someone else's testimony. He is experiencing for himself firsthand and telling us about it. So as he looks around the world, these are the types of things that he observes. You know, sometimes there's a time to kill, sometimes there's a time to heal, sometimes there's a time to break down, and sometimes there's a time to build up. There's a time to weep, there's a time to laugh, there's a time to mourn, there's a time to dance. You know, we won't read the whole section there. But notice these things. There is a specific time for specific activities to be done and specific emotions to be shown. What's the problem? The problem is humans do not know when it is appropriate to participate in an activity or experience a certain emotion. Humans don't have that knowledge. Now notice who provides the connection between the activity and the certain time. God. God is the one who provides the connection. He is the one that orders the world in such a way that there is an appropriate time for everything. Humans just don't know that time. We keep going. We're in verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? So if there are things in the world to be had, certain emotions that humans should show, certain activities and rewards that humans should experience, but humans don't know the proper time, we see why Kohelet says what he says in verse 9, right? What gain has the worker from his toil? People participate in this life, but they never really get out of life what they're supposed to get out of life. You keep going in verse 10. I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Notice again, this is personal experience. He has seen it with his own eyes, but notice this is our evidence for God providing the connection between the certain activity or certain emotion and the proper time. God is the one. He has made everything beautiful in its time. This verse is difficult. In fact, probably one of the most difficult verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. We see that Kohelet is frustrated with the order of the world and how God has set things up. But then we get down to verse 11 and we read, He has made everything beautiful in its time. And maybe we start to see the positive side of things here. Maybe we start to see that things aren't as dark and gloomy as they might seem to be. And we keep reading. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart. Well, that's a good thing, right? We think about eternity for a second. Eternity is a divine attribute. It's a divine quality. Well, what would the opposite be? If we're thinking in terms of opposites again, like we did in verses 1 through 8, what would the opposite of eternity be? Think about it for a second. Mortality, right? Mortality is a very human characteristic, human quality. God has put eternity into every man's heart. Notice how God works. He acts in the world. But notice the end of that verse. Yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the very beginning to the end. We seem to maybe be going in a more positive direction, but now we're chopped down again and we're seeing the gloom. Humans aren't able to understand the ways of God. Humans aren't able to understand virtually anything about God from what we read in verse 11. And if humans can't understand the work that God has done from the beginning, there's no possible way that humans can understand the appropriate time to do something, and that ultimately rends life meaningless and useless. I perceived, verse 12, that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Now notice again, personal experience, I perceived that there is nothing better. Now this isn't like the highest good that we could possibly imagine. Okay, so it's not the best thing that we could possibly do. That's not how we're supposed to read this. Notice what Kohelet has been arguing. Life is meaningless. Life is useless. It doesn't have a purpose because humans don't. They can't understand God. And if they can't understand God, they don't know when it's appropriate to do or have certain emotions. So how do you find some satisfaction? Well, you do what we've already read about in chapter 2. You eat, you drink, and, you try to find some pleasure in your toil. Notice the attitude of resignation here. Humans can't understand the big picture. They can't understand what they need to understand, so you ought to just give up. You ought to give up, and you ought to find a way that you can find a little bit of pleasure in this ginormous game of life. Because God's messing with you. So maybe try to find some pleasure in the simple pleasures of life. But we have a problem. Because in verse 13, what we just talked about, also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. Notice what's at the end. This is God's gift to man. So not everyone is even able to experience the most simple and sensual pleasures of life. Because God is the one that provides one with the opportunity to do those things or to experience the result that we have in mind here. And we kind of get the feel from Kohelet's attitude as he's been talking that he is not one of these individuals that is able to eat and drink and, find some pleasure in his toil. This isn't, Kohelet so far, I guess we should say, hasn't presented a very pious view of God, not one certainly that we would be comfortable with. God is well, we'll keep reading and we'll get there. I was going to maybe add a comment in there, but it'll fit better somewhere else. Keep reading in verse 14. I perceived, notice again, firsthand experience, that whatever God does endures forever, nothing can be added to it nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people should fear, or so that people fear before Him. Well, notice we run into the same problem that we saw in chapter 1. Everything that is, has been, and will be. That is to say, the present is the same as the past, and what is implied by that? Well, the future will be the same as the past and the present, right? Well, so it is with God. Whatever God wills, that's going to happen. It has always happened, and humans can't interfere with that. And if humans can't interfere with the ways of God or the way that God has ordered the universe, that's why humans should simply resign and give up in this quest of trying to find meaning and purpose in this life, and they should just eat, drink, and maybe find some pleasure in their toil. But notice why God has set the world up in this way, so that people should fear Him. Now, we might remember from our study of the book of Job that Job had some qualities that were about him that were introduced at the beginning of the book that were very, very good. Job was one who feared God, right? That was one of the qualities. And there's 4 given to Job, and like we said, those 4 given to Job, anyone in the Old Testament at this point in time would have been happy just to be given one. Well, notice this quality of fearing God. You have such great respect. You understand who God is, and that motivates you to serve Him and have a proper perspective of Him and how He acts. That doesn't seem to be the way it's used here. God has ordered the world in the way that He's ordered the world according to Kohelet so that people should be afraid. In other words, God motivates people to love Him and to serve Him off of fear. If you can frighten people enough, that's when they'll serve you. That's when they'll obey you. Well, that's not really pure motivation, is it? Notice how again Kohelet is picturing God. Not in a way that we would agree with. Well, now we move to one of the major themes in the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's the theme of death, which ultimately makes everything in life meaningless, according to the book. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness even there was wickedness. So notice Kohelet now is changing topics, but it still sort of goes along with what he's been talking about. But he's looking around and he's looking and evaluating the place of justice, which would be, we would think of as a court of law. And he's looking at these things, and things aren't right in the court of law. People have obscured guilt and innocence. He's looking around, and people that should be innocent are shown to be guilty, and people that are truly guilty are said to be innocent. And he has a problem with this. Now notice this expression, the place of righteousness. Well, that seems to further be explaining this place of justice. What does that tell us about how people thought of court settings? They thought that courts were a place that you could come and be given what you truly should be given. If you were guilty, you would be pronounced guilty. If you were innocent, you would be pronounced innocent. But that can't be said of the places anymore. These places. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. Now notice we're speaking with the same language that we spoke with in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. There's a time for everything. So Kohelet looks around and he sees that humans aren't able to execute justice in the way that it ought to be executed. But he finds comfort in maybe thinking that one day God will make everything right. One day people will experience their just results. One day people will truly reap what they have sown, despite what they have been given here on earth. And that seems to provide a little bit of comfort, or at least that's how we're set up to believe. But we're going to keep reading, and we're going to realize that's not the case. But we'll have to get to that next week. We'll finish chapter 3 next week and get into chapter 4. I hope you have a great rest of the week. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.